All right, well, I guess we can get started. So yeah, thanks for joining us. My name is Eric Hauge. I'm the Executive Director at Homeline, and you are joining us on one of our Wednesday webinars. Today is Wednesday, February 2nd, and we're excited to be joined today. We originally scheduled this one before RentHelpMN made their announcement last week, hoping to have attorneys Shana, Tomenes, and Max Tsai from Housing Justice Center come and talk about RentHelpMN, but we can still do that. They have plenty to share about RentHelpMN, and we're certain there'll be questions about what's going on with the recent deadline for new and reapplications. But just before we get to Max and Shane, just a few quick overview slides, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, who will provide our brief update about the current phase-out situation. Oh, there we go. So just a background on Homeline. We've been around since '92 and sort of renters throughout the state in English, Spanish, and Somali languages and Hmong. And we have a staff of 27 advocates, attorneys, and organizers. There's our contact information. And in the chat, I'll put links to our information that has been updated since the announcement last week of the RentHelpMN closure. Information about our future webinars and the phase out situation right now. We're going to just be doing another general Q&A seminar later in February. Given that there's been some recent changes, figured that might just be a useful way to go later in February, but hoping to schedule more topics later in the year. So yeah, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel Sterling at Homeline's office, and she'll run through an overview. And then we'll get to Max and Shana.
Thank you. Hello, Rachel Sterling. Those of you who may be new to these webinars, I am the COVID-19 Eviction Response Coordinator and a housing attorney with Homeline. And so the big news thing that everyone's talking about is that RentHelpMN announced last week that they are no longer going to be accepting applications. The deadline to submit applications was 9 p.m. on January 28th. That was this last Friday. So essentially, if you didn't get your application in to a pending review status, so if you didn't hit the submit button, unfortunately, the program at this point is not going to be able to accept applications, and it will show that your application is withdrawn. There may be some other programs that are still available. I'll go through a couple in just a second. But the big thing to know is that RentHelpMN, as of this last Friday at 10 p.m. 9:01 p.m. was no longer accepting new applications, which means you also can't reapply if you had help in the past. But they're the ones that were submitted and in that submitted status by 9 p.m. on the 28th are being reviewed. So they still exist. They're still going through the process, which is what Max and Shana will talk about today, is the process. There's also still utility assistance available through energy assistance programs. There's a link here. But so there are still some things that can be done. It's just a little bit less of a one-stop shop. So if we go on to the next slide. This is, so Ramsey County still has their emergency rental assistance program up and running through the county. They are, so you just have to go to their website, and they, again, this is a tenant-based one because this is still the COVID-19 eviction, or excuse me, the rental assistance funding from the federal government. And so the same restrictions that RentHelp had about who can apply still are in effect, which means that a tenant has to be the one that is doing the application. But as this point, instead of going to RentHelpMN, if you're in Ramsey County, you can go to the Ramsey County Emergency Assistance and apply for funding through that and receive the same protections, the one lingering protection, which I will talk about in a second. And then the next one is going to be for Washington County also has their own program. It's a little bit more confusing than the Ramsey County one, because if you live in Ramsey County, or excuse me, sorry, if you live in Washington County and are a tenant and are behind on rent, you can still apply through the RentHelpMN application portal, but it's going to be money that's coming from Washington County, not the statewide program. So there's a link there as well for the Washington County Emergency Assistance Program. Again, same funding sources, federal funds that were given to the county directly by the federal government, and so still qualify for those lingering protections from the phase out. And then if we go on to the next one, now we'll go to the phase out overview. Renter protections, what the heck am I talking about? So there is a phase out protection for tenants who have a pending COVID-19 emergency rental assistance application. It's very specific in the language about what emergency assistance qualifies and what doesn't. It has to be through one of the federal programs that was part of this COVID-19 emergency relief package that the federal government was putting in place. So that's why it's very specific about which programs we're talking about today, because they qualify under that umbrella for that protection, whereas some other emergency assistance may be able to help with rent, but it's not part of that particular funding source, and so it doesn't qualify under this phase out law for those protections. So, but a tenant who has a pending application with a qualifying program is still protected from eviction for non-payment of rent. So non-payment of evictions, if you have a pending application, should not proceed while the application is in a pending status. So again, RentHelpMN is not accepting any new applications, but again, if you had your application in before the deadline, you are in a pending status, you still have this protection in place until the application is either approved and the money is paid out, or it is like it has a final denial. And I know Max and Shana will talk more about this in a little bit, so I won't get too deep into the weeds there, but know that if you had an application in, you still have this protection. And if you are in one of those counties that has funding and you make one of those applications, you should still be protected as well. So what's happening with evictions in general? This is the slide we've had up for a couple of months now. But again, back in October, most of the protections that were in place, most of the restrictions lifted, and basically any legal eviction that a landlord could bring pre-pandemic is available on the table again, except for the exception for non-payment of rent for those with a pending application. Though that protection lasts, it expires on June 1st of this year. So there's a couple more months left of that. And part of that protection is that a tenant still has to give the landlord and the court proof of the pending application, and if they know a reason for the delay, what's causing the delay. Just a note as well, if you have a pending application and your landlord still files a non-payment of rent eviction, you still have to go to court. And actually, that's just a good advice across the board. If an eviction is filed against you for any reason, whether you agree with it or not, it is really good. You have to show up to the eviction hearing so that you can either make your defenses or tell them you have this pending application. If you don't show up, you're going to get a default and an eviction anyway, because the court's just not going to know about it. If you have tenants can feel free to call Homeline or legal aid, but if they've got questions about specific situations. And then one of the other things that keeps coming up is pre-eviction filing notices. There was a state level pre-eviction filing notice that was part of the phase out and part of the moratoriums that were in place through 2020 in 2021. At this point, there's only 2 cities that are in Minnesota that require a pre-eviction filing notice. That is St. Louis Park and Minneapolis. These are for non-payment evictions. In St. Louis Park, landlord has to give a 7-day notice before they can file for non-payment. In Minneapolis, it's a 14-day notice before they can file. There are also a couple of federal level pre-filing notice requirements for certain types of properties. So the CARES Act has a lingering protection that if you are a CARES Act covered property, which is going to be most of the ones that are covered under VAWA. So, and it has to do with mortgages as well. Like if you're a federally backed mortgage, there are definitely resources to figure out if your property is covered under the CARES Act. But if you are a CARES Act covered property, then you have to give a 30-day notice before you can file an eviction if you're a landlord. And then HUD back in November made a rule that during emergency times that HUD covered properties needed to give a 30-day pre-eviction filing notice as well, and include where any sort of emergency rental assistance could be obtained as part of that notice. So kind of similar, there's a lot of overlap between the CARES Act requirement and the HUD requirement, but the HUD is a little bit more specific about what needs to be in the notice as well. And finally, mask ordinances. This is something January, we saw a big old spike in COVID numbers and things like that. And so mask ordinances in many cities came back into play. As of right now, these are the cities that have mask ordinances. Some of them have an end date. Some of them do not at this point. So we have made a list of all of them and some more of the particular details at Homeline. We have a web page about it. But that's the ones that we were able, that we know about that are in effect right now. And finally, I'm done. Max, Shana, please take it away.
Welcome, Max and Shana. I'll step out of the way and let Max take over on the screen here. And just a reminder to folks that are joining us, we did ask for folks to send questions in advance, have a few of them, but feel free to submit questions in the Q&A over Zoom, and we'll get to those at the end. So with that, I'll let Max and Shana take it over.
Great, thanks Eric. Thanks Rachel. My name is Max Tsai. I am a housing attorney at Housing Justice Center, and I can let my colleague Shana introduce herself as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shana Tomenes. I'm an attorney and I'm the Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Housing Justice Center, and we're excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, so Housing Justice Center is a nonprofit public interest advocacy and legal organization. So we work with renters statewide, though we're based in St. Paul. And one of the projects that we were doing until the end of January was that we were a Rent Help Minnesota field partner. And I've spoken a couple times at these Homeline seminars. And so that's the one big difference between those previous talks and this current one, in addition to Rent Help being closed, is that Housing Justice Center, our contract ended with Minnesota Housing and we are no longer a field partner. So the answers that you're getting today, we're not a field partner. We're not directly connected to Minnesota Housing anymore. We are speaking strictly from our experience and things that we have learned and we know from being a field partner for the, since the opening of the program until Monday. And, by all means, things could have changed in the last couple of days and we would not know about them if there were any new developments. And, I know there are field partners in the chat and maybe folks from Minnesota Housing. So if people have updates to the information that Shana and I give today, please feel free to chime in with those as well. So we'll no longer be monitoring our RentHelpMN line. If people have been to previous talks on that, we had a 1-800 number just for rent help, but we'll no longer be monitoring that one. But if you have any questions, you can always contact us at our general number, which is on the screen there, or at our email info@hjcmn.org. And if you don't get us the first time, we just ask that you leave a voicemail with your contact information, preferably a good callback number and a good time and date to give you a call back, and then just a brief description of what you want to talk to us about. Okay, and with information about ourselves and that disclaimer, I will move on to the next slide here. Okay, oh, and there's our personal emails over here. I forgot I made this one. Okay, so made a little brief agenda for folks. So the first one is just kind of an overview of, it's doubling up a little bit what Rachel talked about, but it's just kind of an overview of the end of rent help. And then we'll be going over a few things that we think will be the things that people will have a lot of questions about in the next few days. So just some basics. How do I check the status of my application? How do I log into my dashboard? So what if I don't know, or I don't think I received a username and password? How do you get that? And then we'll talk about pre-qualification letters. We'll talk about what few application statuses and what an application status means for your rental application, rent assistance application, broadly speaking. We'll talk about documents that people are probably missing. In the last, we were filling applications up until Friday I finished my last application at 8:58 p.m. So right before the deadline. And with a lot of those applications, there's going to be a lot of documents missing. Minnesota Housing, was really helpful in letting people self-attest to things and not submit documents, just so that people could get into that pending status before the 9 p.m. Deadline. But we'll talk about what things are likely going to be asked for by case manager from Rent Help, and ways that people can provide those documents. Finally, we'll talk about appeals. We'll talk about what to do if you're denied your rental assistance. Either you were recently denied this month or so, or if you're denied in this upcoming period. We'll answer a few FAQs, and then we'll leave a pretty robust amount of time at the end for Q&A, because I'm sure folks have lots and lots of questions. Okay, so I just want to start out with some Rent Help Minnesota basics, because I'm not going to assume that people have been necessarily, I'm sure a lot of people have been following since the beginning of this, since and have been with us all the way through. But there may be some people that didn't hear about the program until they heard it was closing. So again, it's federal assistance distributed by Minnesota Housing, and the eligibility part is important because if you applied, even if you got your application in before the 9 p.m. deadline, you still may be denied if you're not eligible to apply. So again, broadly speaking, you had to be low income, and I'll talk about each of these really briefly, but in a little bit more detail. You had to be low income, you had to be eligible for unemployment benefits or experienced kind of a negative impact due to the coronavirus outbreak. And you had to demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness and or housing stability. And again, low income was at or below 80% of area median income, which changes depending on where you live and how many people in your households. And then you needed to provide documentation, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the missing documents part, common missing documents part of our talk. Again, you had to be renting. So again, the basic language is something along the lines of like, I pay money to somebody else for the privilege of living where I am. So that of course covers apartments, covers a lot of single family homes, covers a lot of manufactured housing. For a lot of people, that was their lot rent that they're applying for rental assistance for, but it may even cover hotels, motels, and other informal lease agreements. And those were always subject to review by the program. But the basic language was something along, general rule, very general rule, might not apply to all cases, but the very, very broad general rule was I pay money to somebody for the privilege of being able to live in my residence. So what was covered? It was covered assistance up to 18 months, and that was 18 months of rent and or 18 months of utilities calculated separately. And the costs were only covered. So again, this is why I wanted to cover this. Because for folks that may have recently applied for the first time, costs were only covered if you had back rent due at the time of application. RentHelp never did end up being able to open things up to what was called phase 2 ERA2. Well, they did some ERA2 stuff, but basically they were never before the closure of the program able to open it up to just people who were requesting forward rent. So you did have to still have back rent at the time of the closure of the program due at the time of the application. And a common reason for application denial is if you were somebody who applied for rent help while you were still current for rent. And then I just mentioned really briefly, late fees were covered. So if you had a landlord that was charging you late fees for each month that you were behind at the time of the application, you could have applied. Those are valid costs that you could have applied for when you applied for rent help. And other things on a case-by-case basis would be covered by Minnesota Housing. It just really depended on if it was whether or not they assessed it to qualify as a rental arrear, as like a rental, something you owed for rent, essentially. Okay. Oopsies. Okay, so a lot of people getting their applications in at the last minute. Again, a lot of people may be applying for the first time to rent help at the closure, and I just wanted, the biggest question that we got when we were field partners, really, really common question is just, what is the status of my application? Like, how far along am I? Is there anything I need to do? How do I figure that out? Well, here I listed a few ways to check your status. And the main one, if you don't have, access to a computer, or, if you're just recently applied and just really kind of confused about what's going on, one of the first things that you can do is you can call 211. 211 can provide you a lot of the information that you need for your application. And, if you're not familiar, Minnesota Housing is working with a number of community organizations, through a field partner program. And those field partners help people navigate the application process. They help them communicate with Minnesota Housing, communicate with Minnesota Housing's processors. And so, if you were somebody who wants additional application assistance, you can ask to have your application connected to a field partner. That would be the wording that should work with the folks on 211. And basically they'll connect your application to a field partner number, or they'll give you the contact information to contact a field partner. And basically that's another way to get some more assistance in your application, and also to figure out the status of your application. Number two way to figure out the status of your application is to log into your dashboard. And when you log into your dashboard, that's available at apply.renthelpmn.org/login is the fastest way to do that. I should have put that on the slide, but you can also access it from the main RentHelpMN.org page. And if you log into the dashboard, I'll show an example of a dashboard and kind of where you can see the status from there. But that is the quickest and most straightforward way to get regular updates, to get the most up-to-date information about your application. If you're a landlord, this applies not just to checking statuses, but to lots of other things. You can also email landlords at RentHelpMN.org if you have any questions and you happen to be a landlord. And then I discussed the field partner thing earlier, but if your application is already connected to a field partner and you already have the contact information for a field partner, or if a field partner was the one that actually helped you apply for RentHelpMN, and there's still a field partner after January 31st, then you can ask your field partner for a status update. They should be able to look up if you know your application number, they should be able to look up your application number and be able to get your status that way. If you applied by any number of ways, what a field partner can do is they can help you log into your RentHelp Minnesota account. or help you figure out what your username and password is, and they can figure out your status that way as well. Okay, so what if I applied, but I don't know my username or password, or I don't think I have a username or password? Well, there's the password and username recovery, and here's a few common reasons why somebody would use it. Well, first of all, I applied online, but I applied in, December, November, October, I applied whenever, and I don't remember my username and password. Happens to a lot of happens to anybody. It's first of all, the password's not something that a lot of people use the same password for everything, and the password for RentHelp was 15 characters long, so it might have been something that you weren't regularly using, so you might remember your username, you might have forgotten your password, and so you're going to use the username and password recovery for that. All right, the second one that's less intuitive is I applied over the phone. Somebody filled in my application for me online, or with my help, or helped me upload documents or etc. But I forgot my username and password, or because I didn't write it down, or I remembered it at the time and I thought it was something that I would remember, but I didn't I don't have that information anymore, or both myself, applicant and field partner were going really, really fast. It just didn't occur to anybody to make sure that I knew my username and password, which totally could happen. Again, we were doing applications till like 8:58, and there was quite a bit of going as fast as we could for that. So that could totally happen. So that's another reason why somebody might not know their username or password. And the third one is a really common one as well. It's like I applied using a paper application. And the big thing that I want people with paper applications to know, or I want landlords or folks on the call who might know a tenant who might have applied by paper to know, is that if you applied using a paper application, an online application should have been created for you. And the way that you would figure out what your username and password are for that is that it should be created for you, and then you would be able to access it by using the username and password recovery. So that's one that people are doing a paper application, they're thinking there's nothing online for me, but actually an online application is usually created for you and linked essentially to it becomes your paper application becomes an online application. And so you'll need to know, it's really helpful for folks with a paper application to know their username and password. Okay, so username and password recovery. You go to apply.renthelpmn.org/login. Again, you can get to it from the main page. You can get to it without the /login part, but this is if you want the fastest way to get to your login page, to get to your forget password, forget username thing, it's apply.renthelpmn.org/login. The big thing is you will need the email and or the phone number that was used on the application. Now, something that we've had happen a few times is, somebody applied for RentHelp, and in the interim, they no longer have access to the phone, or the phone's disconnected, or the phone broke and they aren't able to use the phone. Even more common is I used a burner email for my RentHelp application, or I don't remember any of the login credentials for my email, or I just made up something for the email spot because I had to fill in something for an email. If it's the case that somebody doesn't know their email or can't access their email and doesn't know their phone number or can't use that phone number that they use on the application, you can't use the regular password and username recovery. In that case, you'll need to call 211, see if they can change your username and password. If they can't, then you need to get connected to a field partner and see if they can email. We would email field support when we were field partners and get that email and phone number updated on the application. And once that's updated, then you could use the forget password, forget username steps that I'm about to outline right now. Okay, forget username looks like this. So you click on, so I've got it on the left, you click on forget username, and then you get to the page on the right And again, you have two different methods. You can either use email, or you can use phone number for folks that don't like to use their email, don't have access to it, etc. You can also select to have the information given to you by text message or by phone call. And what will happen is that they're either going to get a text, a phone call, or an email with a series of numbers. Once you hit that blue button for forget username code, forget username code, it'll ask you for the series of numbers that was either sent by text, call, or email. You'll enter that in, and then the page on the right will show what the person's username is. So it will. So that's the most straightforward way to get the username back. Forget password, you do the same thing. So you go to apply.renthelpmn.org/login. You click forget password. You get the you type in your username. Then you select. Then you get to a page that's really similar to this one on the right. With an email or a phone number. You type in the email or the phone number. You get a code. And then it will allow you to type in a new password. And apologies, I didn't take screenshots of that. But the important thing is that the new password has to be a minimum of 15 characters. And it doesn't have any requirements, lowercase, uppercase, symbols, spaces, etc. It just has to be 15 characters of whatever is going to be easiest to remember. Okay. So really briefly, once you get logged in, so once you know your username, once you know your password, and once you log in, you should be seeing something like this. This is from a few months ago, but largely it should look like this still. And on the left, you'll have a number much higher than the number here, which is 63873. It'll be something in the 6 digits at least. You'll see that you applied for the COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program. You'll see the status in the middle. You'll see a brief explanation. And then on the right, this one says begin application. But since people have applied, or if they can't apply, they can't add anything else, that one should say pre-qualification letter instead on the far right there. Okay. So once you know your status, either calling 211 or logging in and finding it out, what is a pending status? And a pending status is more important than ever, because things that are not a pending stat, or it's always very important, but it's now more important to know for the reason that you can't reapply and you can't finish your application anymore. So a pending status is a status that is still being processed by Minnesota Housing. So a non-exhaustive list of things that are, if you see your application is in this status, it means it's still being looked at by Minnesota Housing, even though the program closed on last Friday. So you don't have to worry about, could change to something that's not a pending status, but it's not the issue that you didn't get your application in on time. So for folks who turned in an application before 9 p.m. on Friday, if you had recently submitted an application, a really common status is pending initial review, which just means that the processor hasn't had the chance to look at it yet, but your application is complete and pending, which is the important things, and that you got it in under the deadline. An application status that did not get it into the deadline would say incomplete, or it may by this time say withdrawn, which I'll get to in a minute. Some other examples of pending statuses that mean that you got your application is not complete yet, it's still being processed, but you got your application in before the deadline are requires applicant response. So that's different than incomplete, and that's different than kind of like the in progress one. That one does require that the applicant do something, and the something hopefully is communicated to the applicant. If not, again, contact field partner or contact 211. But your application is pending and you did get it in before the deadline. Okay, some other pending statuses. Declined by landlord is a really one I want to bring up. I brought it up on my last talk, but it is still a pending status because an application can go directly to a tenant if it's declined by a landlord. So a landlord can say, for whatever reason, I don't want rent help, etc. And so long as it's not something that would disqualify the applicant. A common one would be the landlord saying the applicant doesn't live here, so they can't apply for, and the applicant's not if the applicant's not applying for a former address application, which we covered in previous talks and is a little bit irrelevant right now, so I won't talk about it too much. Then that could be something where it's declined by landlord, but then it becomes declined by program because they're not eligible. If it's just declined by landlord, your application is still pending. You may want to do some things to clear things up, but it's still a pending status that's protected by the off-ramp. Appeal pending. Again, you've been denied by RentHelpMN before, but you put in an appeal in a timely manner. So your appeal is pending, and appeal pending is a protected status under the off-ramp rules. Final review is not a completed application yet. You're still in process, and so you're still protected by the off-ramp. Some things that are not pending statuses, and these are things where you do not have your application is not being processed, and you do not have a pending RentHelpMN status, and you do not have the off-ramp protections, are declined by program. This means that something in your application means that you're not eligible, or something required applicant response, and the case manager felt like you didn't respond, or for whatever reason, declined the application. So that would be declined by program, and that's not a pending status. Same thing for decline by renter, which is less common, but has happened, and that would mean that you don't have a pending status. Finally, withdrawn is an example of a not pending status. Now, sometimes withdrawn can happen if somebody, for example, decided to move or had some sort of settlement or something and decided they didn't want RentHelp anymore. Then on occasion, we, as a field partner, if we were linked to their application, we could contact, or actually no, in this case, the renter has to actually contact 211 and tell them, I don't want my application anymore. And I've been asked on one occasion whether to confirm that to be the case. So if the renter asks for it, that's going to be an example of withdrawn. But a common, and this was our understanding when we were still field partners, was if you were incomplete at the time that the program closed, so last Friday, 9 p.m., then your application would be withdrawn if you were still in that incomplete status. So something that could happen is that, somebody starts an application, they, life happens, or they didn't know that the program's closing Friday. The deadline passes, it was incomplete, but it becomes withdrawn. Now, incomplete wasn't protected by the off-ramp anyway. But previously you'd be able to just finish that application, get it in, and then you would have a pending status under the off-ramp. But, if it's withdrawn, there's not much to do about it other than appeal. And we'll talk about appeals later, but that's not a pending status, and that is not protected by the off-ramp. Okay, next thing. Okay, common requested documents. Okay, so like I've mentioned a couple times, field partners, 211, people in general going to the RentHelp website, a lot of people rushing to try to finish their applications before 9 p.m. One thing that took the most amount of time doing applications was getting the documents that you needed to put together for a RentHelp application. So, these included the things I have on the screen: a rent ledger, which is just the amount that you owe broken down by the month; a rental agreement, so a lease is the most common, but sometimes people could submit other things that would stand in the place of a lease; a utility bill. One thing I should have put in here was income verification, which was often the hardest thing to get because people would have to get a lot of pay stubs together if they were trying to prove it that way, or try to get their tax documents together. So, these are things that people, if you're working with somebody, or if you know somebody who, or if you are somebody, or if you're a landlord of somebody who submitted it at the last minute, submitted it on Friday, it's really likely that you'll need to put together these documents. You'll need to put together a rent ledger, Preferably it's put together by the landlord on, the landlord's with the landlord's, not looking for watermark, but landlord's letterhead. Letterhead's the word I'm looking for. So on a landlord's letterhead, and most preferably broken down by the month. So say, tenant owes for May. Sorry, let me use closer months. December, January, and Feb, and was thinking at the time that they would owe for February. An ideal rent ledger would say that Joe tenant owes $1,000 for December 2021, $1,000 for January 2022, and $1,000 for February 2022. And which is more ideal than something that says, they owe $2,000 in rent and they are asking for $1,000. Ideally, you'd have a rent ledger on the landlord's letterhead that's breaking things down by the month. And if possible, submit that. If not, I'll talk about that with one of the self-verification forms I'll cover in more detail. But submitting something's better than nothing. Just the ideal is broken down by month. Rental agreement, usually a lease. Sometimes a letter has worked, but usually some sort of lease. And then the utility bill is usually tenant reaching out to the utility and trying to get it via, mailing or electronically. So contacting Excel, contacting Centerpoint, contacting your PUC is going to be the best way to get those documents. But if you're somebody who submitted something, Friday at 7 p.m., Friday at 8 p.m., Friday at 9, or not 9, Friday at 8:45 p.m., know that you'll probably need to get these documents, and you can even start doing that right now. You don't need to wait for RentHelp to reach out to you. You can probably get those ready right now if you have them, because somebody at RentHelp will probably ask you for them. Okay, and if you don't have any individual form, or if case manager reaches out to you and say, hey, do you have any proof of income? And you're like, I get paid, but it's really hard for me to get my pay stubs, or I get paid in cash. There are self-verification forms available for almost everything. I'll go through it in a little bit more detail. So, if there's something that's requested, you don't have it, don't stress. Call 211, get connected to a field partner, or if you're already working with a field partner, tell your field partner, or go online yourself. There are self-verification forms for many, many parts of the application, almost every part. Okay. So, if you're a landlord with a lot of tenants, if you're an attorney with a lot of clients, et cetera, you might want to print out a bunch of self-verification forms, especially if a lot of people got their applications in at the last minute. It's advised to only use this if document submission is unavailable and practical. It's always better if you have, pay stubs from your employer, if you have a ledger from the landlord, if you have a copy of your original lease, like your real lease, and you can get it from the landlord. These are always preferable to a self-verification form, but life's not perfect, and neither are RentHelpMN applications. And so these these self-verification forms are here to fill in the gaps for folks, because there are lots and lots of reasons, very, very good reasons, why a person would not have one document or another. One that I wanted to go, and here's a non-exhaustive list of things you can self-certify for. So you can self-certify your rent statement, your rental agreement. You can self-certify that you have no income. If you are somebody that, does not receive any government assistance and does not have wages, you can self-certify that right now you have no income. You can self-certify to ID if you're somebody who doesn't have a driver's license or doesn't have any government issued ID. And you can self-certify that you are somebody on the lease. So a household change, if you were added onto the lease later, for instance, and you're the one who applying for RentHelp, something that might happen is that, the case manager says, oh, you're not in the lease. Like, do you actually live there? Well, that's something you can self-certify. I actually live here, but the lease doesn't reflect that. Okay, the self-certification form that we use the most, maybe it's different for other field partners, but the one that we use the most was the rent statement / ledger self-certification. And the reason that we use this is because sometimes, sometimes things would be locked, or it'd be hard to get a landlord ledger. But long story short, we would use this form a lot. And the big important part is that there's this table at the bottom of the form. So again, you're looking for the emergency rent assistance program statement, ledger, rent due, and then you would go to this big table, and this big table would have, you would fill in this table with the correct amounts. Another reason that somebody might want to fill this out is that their landlord gave them a ledger in like November, but they need accurate amounts for December and January, and the landlord won't give them a ledger. You can use a self-certification to fill that out instead. Okay, finally, one thing that courts are asking for, or landlords may ask for, is a pre-qualification letter. Again, this blue button should say pre-qualification letter, not begin application, because we are past the end of rent help. And it would look like this. And apologies for my bad art. So it will say the app number, where this is redacted from somebody's real pre-application number, pre-qualification letter. But it'll say today's date, it'll say their current status as of today's date. It will have their name, and it'll have the date that they submitted an application, and then it'll have some legalese about what a pending rent help application means under state law. Okay, and with that, I think, Shana, this is the slide I'm passing it off to you for, right?
Perfect. Yeah, that works great. So these are some Rachel was wonderful, and she kind of went over the off-ramp more extensively than I will here. I just always like to flag this, that the final protections, the things that you've been hearing about in the news, the off-ramp, those things end in June for non-payment of rent. So right now, if you have a pending application, if you have one of those protected statuses that Max brought up, you are protected from eviction for non-payment of rent. So if you're a landlord and you're like, hey, I know that someone that I'm renting to is behind on rent, you can check your landlord portal to make sure that what the status of their application is. Often they need things from landlords as well, so it's always good to check that on both sides. And if you are a tenant and you have a pending RentHelpMN application and you get that eviction notice, I just really want to reiterate, you need to make sure to both reach out to your landlord, say, hey, by the way, I don't know how this got missed, but I applied for RentHelpMN. Here's my pre-qualification letter. And then also make sure to go to court. What you never want to have happen is that something get lost in miscommunication. It's always err on the side of showing up. And if I could have the next slide, please, Max. Here's another piece that I kind of wanted to focus on today, which is, what if we are denied? So if there's something that, if you got an application in and you are now facing a denial for RentHelpMN, that most commonly comes via email. So if you had any email address on file, I always say check your email every day. This is something, and it doesn't look like a big fancy letterhead. It's not saying, please read urgent, big exclamation mark. This is something important. It's a notification, and it says, your application has been withdrawn. You have been denied RentHelpMN by program. It'll say something like that, and maybe a brief explanation afterwards. Like, we have been trying to communicate with you for 6 times over the last 20 days and have not heard from you. The most common reasons for denial have been lack of communication and incomplete documents. RentHelpMN does a great job of trying to reach out via phone or via email at least 3 times, but those are fast and life is really busy. And I know that this is something that it can get really easily missed. So it's just really important that if you right now are in the situation and you're attending this webinar because you have a pending rent help application, that you just are really checking and rechecking those, your email, your voicemails. Make sure you can get voicemails. I am the biggest offender of this, of having a voicemail box that I don't always check, but make sure to check them because people do leave you voicemails on it and you want to be able to get back to them right away. And then the other, like Max talked about, if you were trying to pull together some things last second and you have incomplete documents, you really want to make sure that you get those in as soon as possible when they're asked for, or explain why you don't have something. If you don't have an ID and you need an accommodation, That's something that's a communication and ongoing accommodation can be made for things that you're missing, or you can brainstorm and be connected with a field partner to help you access things that are difficult for you to obtain. And the next piece is how to appeal a RentHelpMN denial. By applying for RentHelpMN, you have the right to appeal the decision if you are denied. The appeal can be done via mail or fax. It can't be done by calling 211 or by, sending an email back saying, hey, you got something mixed up. It has to be done through the formal process. So there's instructions on RentHelpMN.org/resources, and there's all the cover letters and an explanation letter going over what I'm about to say is in there as well. The appeal must be sent within 10 days of you getting that email. Most likely it's an email. And there isn't a specific form. It doesn't say, hey, fill this out or anything like that. Instead, it's going to be something that you create that has your information. So like your name, your address, if you have that application ID number, that's so important. That's how we tell people apart in the system. And if you know why you were denied, if it said in that email, you were denied because of this reason, you can just put that in there. And then you can say why you think that's wrong. If you say, hey, it says that I didn't reach out to you, but I did email back the same day. I put something in right afterwards, and I think something got lost. I mean, there's a lot of people, and hopefully this never happens, but accidents happen to all people. So it's important to, just say what's going on there. And then why you should be eligible. So you're saying, hey, I did everything, or you made a mistake, or here's the information that you needed. And you can put that all in there. And then in that fax or that mail, you want to include letter, cover letter, and documents. And you want to make sure to make a copy of all of those things. Like I said, it's only via mail or fax. So it's not like you're going to have an e-copy necessarily, and you're going to want to keep that. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Important things that within 10 days means that you really want to make sure that within 10 days of it being declined by program, denied, anything like that, that you're sending that in. I'm a lawyer, Max is a lawyer. We could argue about what 10 days means until the cows come home. But what you don't want to do is be in that place. You want to be in the place where it's, you got it today and you're already on top of it. If you have questions, shameless plug, you can always call us at the Housing Justice Center. We are happy to talk to you about that. Other field partners, if you are working through a program, are happy to talk to you. Pending appeal is an application status under the off-ramp. So appeals take time, and historically they have taken anywhere from 2 weeks to a couple months. And I am sure that it'll be different now that the application isn't open, and we don't know yet because it just closed on Friday what that actually looks like. But while you're navigating that appeal process, that is a protected status, and you cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent while you are filing an appeal. There's probably going to be a lag between when you send all of that off and when it gets uploaded onto the portal. So again, reiterating, you really want to make sure you got a copy of that, so that way you can show that you have appealed this decision and remain protected. All right, if I could have the next one, sorry, thank you. And then who can help me file an appeal? If you have questions, always ask. It's always helpful. These sorts of things can be confusing and it's stressful. You can contact, if you're working with a field partner to fill out this application, they would love to help you. You can also be connected with a field partner. If you were filling out this application and you did it by yourself, but now you want some help, you can call 211 to be connected with a field partner who can help work with you. You can also call us. We're at the Housing Justice Center. We are happy to help you. And our telephone number is there. And just, that appeal timeline is really short. So just make sure that as soon as you get that information that you're sending that on, so that way, the other person who's working with you has the time to give you excellent customer service. You don't feel stressed by taking care of things in a very short amount of time, and you get everything taken care of. Sorry, the next one, please. Oh, and we're on to frequently asked questions already. Excellent. So I'm hoping to leave enough time here, and we're right on track to leave a half hour for questions, but these are some things that we hear all the time. So the first is if you applied by the deadline and you're worried about the money that it is. Will RentHelpMN run out of money before your application is processed? Based on what we know, it is unlikely that the program will run out of money and will be able to process and pay all the applications that are pending. That was the main reason they closed so early, is they wanted to honor these sorts applications. And so that is what we are hearing right now. And then the next question is, does my landlord have to participate in the RentHelpMN process? No, your landlord doesn't have to accept funds from RentHelpMN. And if you know that they are not going to work with the program, you can call 211 or have them contact 211, and that can move your application along with it a little faster. The caveat is, and your landlord will want to know this as well, if they don't want to participate in the RentHelpMN process, the money will go directly to the tenant, and then you can use that money to pay your rent that you are behind on. And then the last one is real common, is if you've moved or plan to move before you have been approved for RentHelpMN, your application would be denied and you won't have the opportunity to reapply because this is closed. So if you were filling out an application for a residence you are currently living in, that's your application that you have, and that's the information that Minnesota Housing RentHelpMN will be looking at. If you there was a different application if it was for a former residence. So if you were, hey, I've moved to a new place and I'm looking to apply at that place to have my old place covered through RentHelpMN, there was a different application to fill out, and they are also going through those applications. And then I saw this also in the chat, so I want to address it right here. So how many months of assistance can you ask for? It's 18 months of rent and utilities, and it has to be, it's a total of 18 months, meaning 18 month rents and 18 months utilities, or 18 months rent, 5 months utilities. It can be whichever it is. So that's the total amount. And the first day is April 2020 through, February 2022, if you got that 1 month of forward rent. And can your landlord evict you after you receive assistance? So landlord cannot evict tenants for non-payment of rent while the application is pending. But during that pending period, that you can be evicted for material breach reasons. And then afterwards, if you are not behind on rent, you can't be evicted for, being late with getting your RentHelpMN money. It would be for other reasons. So it's not, this funding is to cover that gap for the non-payment. Then the next one, thank you. And then Max went over this on how to check the status. You want to make sure that you never want to be worried about it. It's just something that is stressful and you want to make sure you can get through, so you can check your portal or call 211. You'll also, as your application moves through the process, you're supposed to get an email update every time, and technology isn't perfect. But if you see that, that's what that is. You might get an email saying, hey, John, your status went to requires applicant response. And then oh, hey, they're looking at my application and they have something that they need from me, or I need to answer a question. I'm going to go check that out. And then sometimes the case managers will call you. They have a question. They want to make sure they get something right. They're going to need a new document from you. So that's why it's really important to check your voicemails. And then as for, does the landlord or tenant get a letter when they reach funding approved? This is another thing that's in the chat. You should receive confirmation after the payment is sent, and it's not immediate. It's not, the check goes out and at the same time they're sending this letter. There's sometimes a little bit of a lag, but you should get a payment letter, and the payment letter shows the breakdowns of the months requested and the amount of the total assistance. So that information, if you don't have that and you were paid, say maybe you're a landlord and you want to make sure that everything's covered and you got a check in the mail 2 months ago and you never got that final letter, or you're a tenant in the same situation, that is something that you can receive by calling 211. All right. And I think we wrapped it up, and thank you so much for everything. I think we got quite a few questions in the Q&A.
Well done. Yeah, that was a lot of great information. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've got some pre-submitted questions. We've got some Q&A questions. Looks like we did get a couple questions in the chat. We will do our best to sift through all of those as well. So I think Eric and I are going to focus on the rent help questions for while we have you two. And then I know we also did get some questions that aren't specific to rent help that I will be trying to tackle as well. So Eric, do you want to start us off?
Sure, and you may have gotten to some of these, but we'll just ask them all, and so it can get recovered if necessary. So let's see here. We'll jump to this one. Janelle in the Q&A was also submitted in advance. We have a conciliation court coming up. Will a tenant be able to complete the existing claim that is in RentHelpMN? We had a very reduced payment from RentHelpMN. Landlord was contacted by a RentHelp employee who noticed less amount but never saw a payment to make up the difference. And then there's a similar question in the chat from Janelle about maybe the same situation, can a judge order a tenant to submit an appeal?
So I can answer the first part. The tenant being able to complete the existing claim really depends on what the existing claim is. Now, if the existing claim was incomplete at the time, it's really unlikely that the tenant's able to complete it because it's going to be withdrawn. And I see a question later on that we'll get to when we get to, but basically if you had an incomplete application at 9:01 of last Friday, your application will get withdrawn. So, and again, withdrawn is not something that the program's going to work on. It's not something that you can, submit documents to, etc., without an appeal. Your option there is to appeal, but otherwise that application is not going to be processed. Now, the tenant can complete an existing claim, and/or the program can complete the claim if the application is in one of the pending statuses. Again, a really common pending status feels right before the program close is pending initial review, which means it hasn't been looked at by a case manager, but it's been accepted. And that one can continue to be worked on up until the program ends. The judge question, I don't really have an answer to.
Yeah, I would say to the judge question, I haven't experienced that situation. District court judges have very broad powers, and that being said, that's a very short time period. So the likelihood of someone being denied and having that appeal and having the ability to appeal being at the same time between the court hearing, I don't know how likely that is. This also is a tenant program. So I always want to reiterate that this is something that is the tenant's benefit, and it's kind of ran to be for them. And if they choose for whatever reason not to want to join and be part of this program, that is their choice to do so.
And I'm going to jump in here a second. A conciliation court judge or referee likely isn't going to have the ability to make that sort of order. District courts and conciliation courts are two different beasts, and so what can happen in one doesn't necessarily able to happen in the other. So yeah, it's likely that that is not something that could be ordered. It might be something that, if it is with the time period, might be able to be agreed to by the parties, but a great question we don't know the answer to, because it hasn't come up in our experiences yet. So I suppose it's my turn to ask a question now. Sorry. All right. So this one's from Anandi, a landlord who looks like they submitted a question both before this and in the Q&A. So it's they're saying, from the facts column in the RentHelpMN website, they read that the tenant is eligible to claim rental assistance for up to 18 months, including 1 month of future rent. So if this tenant has gotten 7 months of rental assistance from Hennepin County in 2020, and has gotten some rent help assistance for 12 months in 2021, are they eligible for any rental assistance for 4 more months if they submitted the application before January 28th? Due to the high volume of applications, I know as a landlord, I need to wait for longer, but is the decision going to be made by 2022 that the tenant has maxed out of receiving funding and so the application is denied? What should this landlord's next steps be on losing out on 4 months of rent? So there's a lot of different questions in there.
Yeah, and I'll do my best here, and hopefully Max will keep me honest if I miss something and cover me. So these programs are confusing because there is local programs and then there's RentHelpMN. And the RentHelpMN will cover 18 months of back rent, and that's total. So if these 7 months are through Hennepin County are not through RentHelpMN and are through a different program, those don't count against the 18. That being said, it gets more confusing because Hennepin County sometimes is working through RentHelpMN. So that's a really confusing way to say that it's hard to count these months. But it has to be 18 months total. They don't go over 18 months and do like 21 or 20, anything like that. And those count from anywhere, like you said, some of them were from 2020. So anything from, March, April 2020 through the months forward that they would have been able to be paid under this program is the total amount that they would be able to do. As far as processing these claims, there are things that are easy for a processor to see and know that someone's eligible or not eligible, and there's things that it's hard for them to see and it takes time. So in my experience, if someone's not eligible because they've asked for too many months through this program, one, it's difficult to fill out an application. Those months get grayed out and there's only so many ways you can apply. And two, if it's something that they look at it right away and they say, oh, I'm counting these months and the numbers aren't there, this person isn't eligible for this program anymore, the declining tends to happen sooner. I wish I had a magic ball to tell you how long that takes, but that's what the program looks like for that.
Nope, that's a perfect answer. I don't have anything to add to that other than to reiterate that it's really hard to tell on an individual basis because of that the overlap can get really confusing between Hennepin County and RentHelp. And where it may overlap or be parallel, it's hard to know for each individual application without being either Hennepin County or RentHelp.
And so this actually leads to another question that Kelly, an advocate, posed, which you kind of have answered, but somebody who they helped apply for and expecting 18 months and then seeing that it wasn't sent. So at this point, who's the best contact? 211 to a field partner?
That's right. The first thing that you're going to want to get a copy of is that payment sent letter. And essentially that will confirm which months the person was approved for, which months that, they actually received. Now, the landlord confirmation and what the person submits, sometimes there's a discrepancy. And that's where things get really confusing. And that's where amounts may sometimes be more, may sometimes be less. It's all in the interest of trying to get the tenant and the landlord on the same page and to have the tenant's arrears, so their rent, what they're due for rent, eliminated, and if it's, to try to figure out what amount is owed. But in that process, there's some, that's where the numbers get kind of mixed up. So the first thing you want to get is the payment sent letter to see what was actually approved and what was actually sent out. The second payment is really hard to get from our experience, if there's a gap. And, the hard thing is that things change really fast, because before Tuesday, so before last week, we would have said, you can reapply for the amounts that you still owe because that's back rent. And, you're still, so long as you're still eligible for the program. Now we live in a world where RentHelpMN is closed. So, there's no option to reapply for more funding. So the best thing to do right now is to get connected, 211, get connected to a field partner and see if you can communicate with Minnesota Housing or, see if the person you're advocating for can get sorted out through, whichever means that they can, because it gets really tricky after that first check is sent out and that first amount is approved. So again, in short, 1, try to get that payment sent letter to verify what was actually sent, and then 2, try to get connected to see if there's anything to do to correct it. But it may be tricky.
Thank you. Okay, from the Q&A as well, Anonymous is asking if a tenant has a current or prior application, can they use the reapply button for 1 month at
Our
a time?
understanding is no, because the program's closed.
Okay.
If that's changed, please chime in, somebody, but our understanding as of last is that no, things in are in, things out are, you can't keep applying, unfortunately.
Yep.
Here's a tricky one that we got in advance. Does this mean the complete end of the program? Is there going to be a new one?
So that's a great question. And I think that that's something that right now, what we know is that it's closed and it's not open for applications. If for any reason, there's still money left over, Minnesota Housing, RentHelpMN has said they may reopen. But, I think that that's something that it's worth a call to our state representatives, our state legislature, for if you are experiencing the hardships of this program closing, if you know someone who is, to really reiterate that this program is necessary and what that looks like. There are still, as Rachel talked about, still programs that exist at local levels. So make sure to call 211 and to reach out if you need those resources, but they're never enough and they never have been enough to cover those needs for housing stability. So we really want to make sure that, this program, with it closing so abruptly, that if we can find, with our budget surplus, talk to your legislatures, see what this program looks like and what we can do.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go back to Q&A. So Gina Marie is asking that they said that they noticed that the January 29 deadline, they updated the site, RentHelpMN site, I'm assuming, and many applications are marked withdrawn. You kind of touched about what withdrawn meant, is that it's not something that is going to be worked on. But they do ask as well, when uploading docs to the site, many times they have been uploaded multiple times, that it's still marked as being needed. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, so the first one is that those applications were likely incomplete, which means that the person hadn't gotten to the last screen of the application, hadn't hit the submit button. It doesn't necessarily, you can still complete the application without submitting any documents, but if you didn't hit the submit button and you didn't get all the way till the end, even if you may have registered, and which is another confusing part, is that there's a registration before you actually do the application. Your application was withdrawn because it was still incomplete if you did not get all the way till the end. For the uploading docs thing, that's a really common, I'll use the word bug, not quite sure what's going on there, but it's really, really common. It's happened to us as field partners. It's happened to a couple of navigators on our staff a few times. There is a new Wood O'Brien liaison working with Minnesota Housing. There's also new field partner officer, existing field partner officer, field partners. If you're a field partner, I'd reach out to your resources, your field partner officer, your Wood O'Brien liaison. And if you are not a field partner and this is happening to you, I would reach out to 211, get connected with a field partner, and try to get that addressed by somebody on Minnesota Housing's team, through who will hopefully reach out to the processor. But this is something that does happen. It's really frustrating, and you wouldn't be the only person that's happened to. So don't think that there's anything particularly wrong with the way that you're uploading or anything, because it does happen.
I would say, I always stress this when I experience that. Don't say, oh, I don't need to respond to that because I already gave it to them. And if they just look, it's there.
Yes.
Because that would be my personal inclination, would be, oh, they got it. They must just be a mistake. Whoops, they accidentally sent the wrong email. And that happens. I mean, we're all humans, but you do want to over communicate, always over communicate, because you never want anything to get lost.
All right, thank you. So anonymous question, if a person had COVID and could not work and that's why they will not have rent for February 1st, could they qualify even though the deadline was January 28th?
No, unfortunately, because the deadline was January 28th. So anybody who was current until February and owes rent for February was not again, going back to the beginning of the presentation, you were not eligible at the time the program closed. Therefore, that person is not eligible for rent help and cannot submit an application anyway right now, unfortunately.
Again, there's a few of those local programs that we did
sorry,
talk about.
thanks.
No, that's fine. No, and I'll put those in the chat again, and it's kind of hit and miss right now, but there are some county-based programs that are still available.
Okay, I'm gonna pop over to one from the chat. Charmaine had a couple of different questions, but most of them are related to denials. I know that you tried to touch on some of that already, Shana, but so if a person is denied, how quick is that turnaround time in your experience?
So I think that while you have to appeal the denial extremely quickly, I have seen people that I have worked with where appeals take 2 weeks. I've seen them take 4 months. And really what it comes down to is why the denial happened and how easy it is to look in and investigate that. I would say right now, time will tell what that looks like now that all of the applications are done and they're just processing the applications. It never hurts to check in and just confirm, hey, checking in, I submitted my appeal a couple weeks ago. I want to get a status update on that. And they might not have any new information. It might just be like, oh, the appeal has been received. But that's something that unfortunately we're not really sure what that looks like. But doesn't mean it isn't a worthwhile venture, and just always want to reiterate while you're navigating the appeal process that is a protected status and you cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent during that appeal process.
And if you're not in the denying or appealing a denial or what have you, but it's just your initial application has been denied, what's that processing time on average? I know that's a hard question to answer. Like from when you apply to when you get your first denial, what's that timeline like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. If it's something like that is an eligibility question, maybe they think that you have too many months. Maybe the processor thinks that it's something that's related to maybe you have too much income. So it's a clear denial. Those happen quicker because historically the process has been to look at those things first. So you would find those to be rather quickly and you would be appealing rather quickly. If it's something like there's a communication gap, there is a time period where they wait between communications. Also, it could be later in the process. So it's, you've been going through back and forth and now there's a miscommunication 2 months in, and then that's when that's going to happen. So it can be pretty far along in the process. You always want to make sure you're checking your application.
All right. More questions popping in here, so just try to grab a few more as we have about 10 minutes left. John is asking, is there anything someone who applied for RentHelpMN when they were a current tenant but has since moved out for whatever reason before their application was approved can do now? People in that situation and their landlords are being unfairly penalized due to the timing of the closing of the program.
So you can ask to be connected with a field partner and see if there's anything that Minnesota Housing will do. That's a converse, again, the closing moves so fast. That's something that hopefully they would do, switch the application over, but I don't know, at least I don't know if they would actually do that, and it's maybe unlikely even, but for the reason that you stated in the second half of your question, again, it seems like people in this situation and their landlords are being unfairly penalized due to the timing and due to, at some point the understanding was, okay, I have this current application, but I'm going to move out, so I need to apply for a previous one. But it doesn't hurt to try because there's not really another way to go about it right now.
All right, moving along. Deanna is asking, if an applicant was evicted while the application was pending, is there a public record that they can find for the reason that they were evicted? He called legal services for help, but was still evicted. The sheriff came to the house. The only thing I can guess is that it was evicted for reasons other than non-payment.
Shana and I could probably answer this, but this actually might be a good Homeline question.
Yes, I suppose. Sorry, I saw rent help
No,
and
it's all
then
right.
didn't see the
No,
rest
of
of the
course,
question.
of course. But since you guys look up court records way more than we do.
Me too. So there's a couple of MNCIS, MNCIS is a database of all the court filings that happen throughout the state. They do not give particular reasons why necessarily, why an eviction was filed. There is currently a public database called MICRO, which, because we love acronyms here in the legal realm, MCRO, that is currently available without charge for getting the actual records for things like that. My understanding is that it will not be free and accessible for much longer. So I don't know when I don't remember off the top of my head when that will be moving off, but that right now is what's available.
All right. I was going to jump back to the question. I'm not sure if we got to it, that John put in the chat about, I think you all answered this already. Just tenants, he's seen screenshots from RentHelpMN to tenants saying that an application was approved in payment, but the amount that was paid was not stated. Is that common? Why do they do that? What's the best way for the tenant to determine the amount that was paid other than asking their landlord? I don't think.
So that's a great question, and that's something that we get a lot of. So there's this status that I find it confusing the way it's written. It's called payment sent. And that doesn't, to me, when I think payment sent, that means that somebody walked a check and put it in a mailbox, or they press submit and the money's going to show up electronically. And that's not necessarily true. Payment sent actually can mean anything from that exact occurrence, that payment has been submitted and it's on its way, to it's about to be submitted. So there's a lot of time in between there. And so when you get a status like payment sent, that doesn't necessarily mean that the money was sent. So it doesn't mean that it's a sum certain yet. So it's not necessarily the exact amount. The thing that is going to tell you how much the landlord received the funds for and for what months is going to be that receipt that we talked about, that goes after the landlord has already been paid. If, say, you know that your landlord got the money a month, 2 months ago, they said, we're good to go, or, hey, it's, $80 short, something like that. If that's the conversation that you're having between the landlord and the tenant, that means that the document should exist that would say what that money was intended for and why it's that sum of money. And you can get that by calling 211 and having that sent to you via mail or email.
Quick question that you may or may not actually know the answer to this one. What phone number does Rent Help call people from, and when they leave a message, they identify themselves as Rent Help?
I think it varies, right, Shana? Like,
Yay!
Yeah, that's why it's unanswerable, is because it could be. I mean, they're kind of, so our understanding is that they work from all over the country on kind of their own schedule. So it's hard to know when and what number.
Does it show up as the business's name, the contractor business name, or is it just like individual phone numbers?
Good question. I don't know, Shana, because you might get them on your actual, because I get them through our calling system.
So in my experience, it has, and I just, I have T-Mobile. So I don't know if maybe different carriers are more savvy. But in my experience, it does not show like you're getting a call from the state of Minnesota, or you're getting a call from, I think Wood O'Brien is their processor. So it doesn't say anything like that. The voicemail, they are really good when I've gotten voicemails saying, hey, this is Jane with RentHelpMN. This is my direct dial, call this number, because it's not usually the same number. And it has been a variety of telephone numbers. So it's just if you're seeing a weird call, and also my experience, none of them said spam. So don't think that if it says, you know, spam likely underneath it, I have never had a spam likely one for any of the variety of numbers. It's been a bona fide number.
Thank you.
That's at our 800 number shows up as spam likely. So, you know, it might not be. You know, if that happens to you where somebody doesn't identify themselves, make sure, and you're working with a field partner, make sure to let your field partner know.
Cool. Here's another good question here. If RentHelpMN paid rent on behalf of a tenant in 2021, do they get credit paid for their certificate rent paid so they can get a renter's rebate?
Did you want me to cover this one, Max? Sorry, I went off mute.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, because I know this is on one of the resources.
Yes, so it's on the resources tab, and for the months that were covered by RentHelpMN, the tenant can't claim those as months that they paid. There is not a tax liability for those months, but it isn't a month where you count for it. So that would be the other months that they paid, say maybe, you know, they paid January 2020, February 2020, and then there was 3 months that were covered by RentHelpMN. You would still make sure in the CRP to cover the correct months. But check with that. And then, of course, I always say the caveat that I'm not a tax attorney, I'm a housing attorney. But that's the guidance that we've gotten from the state of Minnesota, which has an awful lot of smart folks there.
And I think, yeah, there's some information on the Department of Revenue's website on the instructions for landlords and filling it out that clarifies this. So I'll put that in the chat.
Perfect. I think from what I'm seeing here in the Q&A, most of the questions that we've got are ones that have been answered, but the question about how much funding remains overall, I think their dashboard is probably, unless you two have, or anyone else has any sort of other resources on that.
Probably the dashboard is the most up to date, though it's a little bit behind right now.
It is, yeah. The board packet where they announced it had some numbers in it that I think they were expecting to receive upwards of approximately 450. That's how much money they have, and they're expecting that that's how many applications they were going to land at with the closure on last Friday. There's obviously other money, as we've talked about, that went to other jurisdictions like the Hennepin, or sorry, the Ramsey and the Washington ones that we put in the chat. So there may be some other programs reopening, but for right now, that's what we know about. There's a question about homeowners assistance for mortgage payments. I know there's like a Home Help MN thing. Do you all know anything about that? Otherwise, I'll just put the link in the chat.
Yep, the link is the most updated.
Yeah, Home Help MN hasn't opened yet, but it is a resource that's coming. I always recommend the Homeownership Center has great resources on foreclosure, forbearance, questions about balloon payments, things like that. They're great folks over there. I mean, shameless plug also, Homeline, great resource. Definitely call Homeline.
I mean, we can only help tenants, so we're not going to be able to help if you're behind on your mortgage, unfortunately.
Still great.
Okay, so that answered that question. There were a couple tenant landlord ones. Do you want to field those, Rachel? There is this one.
Sure.
There's one from Charmaine saying somebody who doesn't have money for February 1st, and it sounds like your application is pending. I think the best advice to that person is to go check your portal, get in touch with a field partner to find out. Continue to maintain and monitor what the status of your application is, because it can come, a denial or an approval can come sort of at any moment, from what I heard from Max and Shana. Oh, did you have an answer to this one, Rachel? Somebody sent us in advance a question about the legal paraprofessional pilot project and wondering who's handling that program to allow paralegal housing court representation, and how can a paralegal get involved?
So it's a great question. I am familiar with it in that I attended a seminar about it at one point when it first opened up last year. But it is being administered by the Minnesota judicial system. There's actually a website that you can go to apply if you are a paraprofessional who wants to get on the approved roster that they're using. You have to have my understanding is you have to have a supervising attorney that applies with you. And so there's some check boxes you have to go through to get on that roster. And then if you are looking for assistance in the areas that the paraprofessionals can assist in, there's a roster of folks that you can contact. Sorry, I'm just pulling up the roster right now is a grand total of 2 pages long. So if you are a paraprofessional that wants to be on there, I would recommend getting in because it will be a small waiting pool of applicant options for folks. But that is what I know about the program at this point. Eric just put the link into kind of the big website page that has all of the details.
And then we had one remaining landlord-tenant question from a tenant. How can a tenant go about seeing if a landlord had entered their home without permission and also made rude comments? So a question about privacy violations.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get some more information, obviously, about the specific instances, but in general, the statute around tenant privacy is that a landlord only has the right to enter if they do 2 things. First, if they have a reasonable business purpose, which is defined under the statute, and if they give a reasonable notice to the tenant before entering. Reasonable notice is not defined. Sometimes it's defined in the lease that you have, but for the most part, it's not. So it's really going to be context specific about what is reasonable or not. And if you have more specific questions about whether something constitutes that or not, or anything else, I would definitely recommend calling Homeline at the number or sending us an email if you prefer.
Yeah, so I put up the number really quick just to remind folks to give us a call, and our upcoming webinars, just one more in February, that'll be a general Q&A as we see what, if anything happens with RentHelpMN in the near future, but we'll have an overall session then. So again, want to thank Housing Justice Center, Max and Shana for being here today and sharing with us all your RentHelpMN knowledge, the insides and outs of everything. So thanks for your time, really appreciate it. And thanks, Rachel, for facilitating. And with that, I think we'll call it a day.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thanks all.
See you later.